Thank you, John, for your generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Hongwoo, for the invitation, and Danny for your hospitality. So I'll get to the point. So the title of my presentation is Ethics and Politics of Nonviolence in Contemporary Times. Recent events such as the pandemic, the war in Gaza, and the Russian invasion in Ukraine remind us time and again the deep structural violence, as well as the many forms of non-physical violence, such as neglect and discrimination around the world. These events bring into sharper focus the words of French philosopher Étienne Balibar. Our world is one marked by the radical inequality of the forms and experiences of death itself. If whole populations are left to die when a country prioritizes certain lives over others, as seen in the United States during the pandemic and other parts of the world, in which members of minority, poor, and colonized communities are dying at a disproportionately higher rate, then where does this leave us? What kind of ethics and politics emerge from considering the violence the world has seen in these times of war and pandemic? But this is not the only question we are left with. The demonstrations against wars in Ukraine and Gaza over the last few months, as well as protests from social movements such as Black Lives Matter, trying to reckon with histories and enduring legacies of colonialism, empire, and racism, raise many questions about the difference between nonviolence and anti-violence. Is it possible to distinguish between different kinds of violence? And if so, how are we to draw such lines? And is the response to all forms of violence an abstract and ideal stance of nonviolence? Is nonviolence, in one sense, the worst kind of violence, as Derrida suggested? These questions urge us to critically rethink violence and practices of nonviolence in social and political life, including the field of education, of course. Over the years, nonviolence has attracted considerable attention in the field of education as an important pathway to advance peace and social justice. Nonviolence has different meanings in different contexts. For example, adopting a peaceful stance in life, avoiding violence and harming others, people, animals, and the environment, using peaceful means in collective struggles for social or political change. A major conceptual resource of nonviolence has come from the use of international wisdom traditions such as Buddhism, Taoism, and African beliefs that advocate nonviolence as inner work and self-transformation. A nonviolent approach in this framework then focuses on personal cultivation of inner peace and involves converting negative psychic energies internally. The idea is that self-transformation will enable social transformation as well. While I deeply appreciate the idea that inner peace and self-transformation are important for social transformation, my concern is about the political potential of nonviolence in pedagogy and education more generally. As some scholars argue, by centering our approach of nonviolence on the reflexive responsibility of the individual, there is the risk of backgrounding the social and political forces and mechanisms that elicit nonviolent structures to change the world. Let me give you a simple example. No matter how much inner peace and self-transformation one may have accomplished from reflecting on the traumatic experiences of the pandemic or the ongoing war in Gaza, there is no guarantee that this will lead to any structural transformation. Here is another example. If one considers the role of state-sanctioned violence in the context of race relations in the United States and the deep entanglement of violence, not only as interpersonal and direct, but also as structural and systemic, then one recognizes how dismantling conditions of violence is not only a matter of the individual. Police brutality, the criminal justice system, violence attributed to poverty, and the neglect of poor populations are just some out of many forms of state-sanctioned violence against the body and whole communities that cannot be overcome by simply focusing on nonviolence as reflexive responsibility. My point today is not to defend nonviolence as an abstract ideal that is self-transformative. Rather, I want to highlight a different approach on nonviolence in pedagogy and education, one that highlights understandings of nonviolence as both subjective and collective resistance to the norms and structures of social injustices and violence. To do so, I draw on Judith Butler's book titled The Force of Nonviolence, which I think Hongwu has it in the list of books out there, which was published in 2020 around the time of the outbreak of the pandemic. And I want to make the argument that any consistent ethics and politics of nonviolence in education, regardless of social or political conditions, in the United States, in Israel, Palestine, in South Africa, and so on, must be grounded in a relentless critique of all forms of violence and the recognition of our shared human vulnerability and relationality, but also our complicity to this violence. In other words, without a closer scrutinization of how we are all complicit, but not to the same degree or manner, to various forms of everyday violence, some visible, others less so, it is not possible to eventually choose non-violence or perhaps anti-violence as the preferred pathway, given that many philosophers think that non-violence as such is an impossibility in an increasingly violent world. The purpose of my talk then is to examine how these ideas can serve as a productive entry point into enriching our understandings of ethical and political responses to violence in the context of education, especially in renewing what I and others have called in the past pedagogies of nonviolence. I will explain soon what I mean by this term. To do so, my talk is divided in three parts. First, I provide a brief discussion of nonviolence and its different approaches in education. Second, I draw on Judith Butler's philosophy to examine more closely the connections between ethics, politics, and nonviolence, and underscore the crucial role of political affects and emotions in a nonviolent approach to social transformation. And finally, I focus on how pedagogies for nonviolence in education may be renewed through the lens of anti-violence in response to the lessons learned from the pandemic and the recent wars in an increasingly violent world. So I'd like to start with a discussion of some competing meanings of nonviolence. Although nonviolence as an ideology and practice has existed for thousands of years throughout the world, especially in various traditions and religions such as Taoism, Hinduism, and Christianity, nonviolence in modern history has been mostly associated with the political movements led by Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King. In particular, the 20th century has seen nonviolence moved from being rooted in religious beliefs to serving as a political tool for social change. Given its mass appeal to thinkers and activists from a range of theologies, philosophies, and theories, nonviolence in the context of education has functioned as an attractive idea for advancing a vision of peace and justice. It is important to highlight here that scholars in various sectors of education, such as peace education, social justice education, and human rights education, to name a few, have advocated that nonviolence provides a useful platform to promote pedagogical ideas and practices in the notion of not doing harm to others, especially those who are marginalized. An important contribution of nonviolent approaches in the context of education comes from works that center on cultivating inner peace and compassionate relationships. These works argue that if educators develop in students the capacity to denounce and prevent violence through personal cultivation and self-transformation, then students' moral responsibility towards others will be developed. The focus of pedagogies for nonviolence then should be on cultivating practices such as nonviolent relationship with the self and a relational dynamic that draws out the compassionate and loving side of humanity to rise above human cruelty and hatred. These ideas, which draw inspiration from Eastern wisdom traditions, conceptualize nonviolence as a daily practice of each individual person that aims at self-transformation and inner peace. Although approaches that turn our attention to the individual's practices of nonviolence make an important contribution to formulating pedagogies for nonviolence, they may inevitably background how personal motivations are entangled with power dynamics. In other words, it is not certain that individuals will make nonviolent choices if they cultivate capacities for inner peace and compassion. Therefore, I would argue that it is important to find ways to include in nonviolent approaches to education an appreciation for the political force of nonviolence. Here is precisely where philosophers such as Hannah Arendt, Frantz Fanon, and Judith Butler may be useful in helping us gain a clearer understanding of violence, nonviolence, and anti-violence. I will focus today on the contributions of Judith Butler. So let me begin by saying that Butler has always made it clear that a central aspect of violence is its varying visibility. Violence is often misrecognized, made invisible, or it is not recognized at all. Importantly, Butler does not draw a demarcation between violence and nonviolence, but rather she sees them as entangled, which makes all of us complicit in manifestations of violence and social injustice. This is why Butler is so adamant that nonviolence ought to be understood not only in ethical, but also in political terms. Furthermore, Butler makes the point that we are all dependent on others and thus compelled to engage with them in ways that are responsible and responsive to that vulnerability, that is, in relations of nonviolence. All of us may inflict or suffer violence. This is why the call for nonviolence makes sense as a way of struggling against that violence. Importantly, the struggle for nonviolence is not an individual one, but rather depends on community ethos and collective responsibility. Nonviolence, thus, is invoked as a struggle against the urge of violence, as the interruption of violence. In this respect, Butler's notion of nonviolence must be understood as political action that strives to interrupt or suspend violence. Butler's analysis of nonviolence in her recent book, The Force of Nonviolence, highlights nonviolence as an ethical and political act that confronts systemic violence and inequality. In this sense, nonviolence is a critical stance and a performative action that makes violence visible. This is especially important in the context of social and political movements such as Black Lives Matter, striving for social justice and equality, or realizations about forms of violence inflicted on many communities, such as discrimination of poor communities or minorities during the pandemic. As Butler argues, a politics of nonviolence must always be engaged in a relentless critical resistance to the norms that distinguish between grievable and less grievable lives. For example, the practice of nonviolence requires a collective opposition to forms of discrimination and exclusion that have been exacerbated in recent years, but have always distinguished lives worth safeguarding from those that are not. Examples of problematic distinctions between grievable and less grievable lives, says Butler, are how certain losses are not about as losses, such as the narratives of Palestinians killed in the Middle East by brutal means, compared to other narratives that are constantly in the spotlight, such as the narratives of Jews killed by Nazis in concentration camps. In this sense, we need to ask, according to Butler, about the conditions under which a grievable life is established and maintained, and through what logic of exclusion. Importantly, then, Butler turns our attention to something that is usually left unaddressed or is treated in uncritical ways when we talk about violence and nonviolence. The necessity of considering the affective dimensions of violence and the affective conditions that maintain and support a consistent politics of nonviolence as resistance. It is to this discussion that I turn next. A central theme in Butler's work since 2004 is how the subject responds ethically and politically to norms that are produced to regulate behavior and action through governing our affects and emotions for political purposes. The norms that govern our lives generate affective structures. This has become vividly evident during the pandemic with the numerous lockdowns imposed in many countries in the name of safety and health, the fear and insecurity which have come to regulate our lives and the various forms of violence inflicted on us as a result of restrictions. These affective responses are implicated in the perpetuation of violence by distinguishing between livable and thus grievable lives from non-livable and thus non-grievable ones. How we recognize and respond to violence, in other words, depends on the differential framing of violence within the social and political structures of liability and vulnerability. This framing is crucial, not only for our affective responses to violence, but also whether we will interrupt or further extend violence. The examples abound. The violence that European states inflict against migrants and refugees at the border or at sea, very often letting them die rather than allowing them to enter the territory under international law, is justified under the pretense that migrants are threats to the nation. The violence that many countries have inflicted against vulnerable communities, poor and minorities during the pandemic, very often leaving them helpless without healthcare. Finally, the violence that the colonized countries around the world have inflicted against poorer colonized countries by extracting their resources. Butler gives us a new perspective to think about violence and nonviolence in contemporary times by offering an account of how to translate this relationality to which we all bound into collective resistance, namely a practice of nonviolence that turns affect, for example, outrage against injustice, into sustained political action. Butler is careful not to present this as an isolated struggle, but rather she considers the political power of nonviolence as an intervention in violence's everyday visibility. Butler is also careful not to privilege nonviolence as the only form of resistance, either strategically or morally. This form of resistance arises from the outrage necessary to combat social injustices in all of their manifestations. In this struggle, it is important to nurture solidarities advocating that all lives can and must be equally valued. Now, on to the last part of my talk. How can such an account of nonviolence be helpful in complicating our pedagogical approaches on nonviolence? What does a pragmatic, non-utopian approach in education look like in contemporary times? I argue that Butler's account of nonviolence offers two crucial insights that have pedagogical value. The first insight emphasizes the need to pay attention to the affective dimensions of nonviolence as resistance. This insight enriches approaches on nonviolence as inner work and self-transformation. The second insight highlights that a crucial issue that needs to be addressed in pedagogies of nonviolence is to navigate through the affective, ethical, and political dynamics of complicity. This insight suggests that handling students' denials of complicity in violence requires a thoughtful pedagogical approach that considers not only how to engage students critically with complicity and its consequences, but also how to foster pedagogical spaces that inspire students to adopt nonviolence as anti-complicity action. To provide more clarity to these two insights, my discussion is presented through an imagined teaching scene in a classroom in which the teacher and their students, it could be a secondary school or a university classroom, attempt to make sense of violent and violent protests emerging during the pandemic. Emerging during the pandemic as a response to lockdowns and the neglect of vulnerable communities in many parts of the world. The driving question behind their exploration in the classroom is how to understand nonviolence in the context of social protests, and what would constitute nonviolent or anti-violent response as resistance in students' everyday lives. To begin with the first insight, I would like to remind you that Butler's account of nonviolence highlights the need to pay attention to nonviolence as resistance as an affective and relational event, rather than merely as an individual act of opposition. This is precisely what opens possibilities for ethical and political critical thought, as well as personal and political transformation. For example, in reference to the imagined teaching scene that I mentioned earlier, this insight implies that before even trying to make sense of social protests in the context of structural injustices, the teacher and their students need to begin examining how violence is built into the affective and normative field of their own classroom in their everyday lives, on the basis of which perceptions and decisions are made over the distribution of vulnerability. To break this chain, and clearly every pedagogy alone cannot do this, the teacher needs to create affective conditions in the classroom through which students will begin to feel ethically and politically responsible towards others who suffer. That is, to feel they have responsibility to resist collectively to structures of social injustice and violence. This would mean, for example, recognizing that nonviolence as resistance is not a set of individualized actions, but rather nonviolent responses in everyday life are very much embedded in the affective infrastructures of classrooms, schools, and communities. Therefore, if we, and by we I mean teachers, academic, parents, students, want to create renewed affective relations that support nonviolence as resistance, it will require that we begin to foster new affective spaces in classrooms, schools, communities that instigate action against norms of violence in our everyday lives. The second insight on pedagogies of nonviolence emphasizes that the constant risks of complicity must be kept in check so that the affective, political, and ethical conditions that support nonviolence are continually questioned. Acknowledging, for example, that all of us are implicated to various forms of violence, yet not in the same manner, is not an easy thing for students to recognize or accept. Therefore, to go back once again to the imagined teaching scene outlined earlier, pedagogical efforts to teach students how to acknowledge their complicity in various forms of violence that perpetuate social injustices, for example, in the recent pandemic, turn out to be a deeply affective process. If a teacher, for instance, attempts to instill moral guilt in students, these attempts will most likely fail, not only because students will be made to feel that the problem is personal, when it is a deeply political one. Most importantly, these attempts will be unsuccessful because they will likely promote a dehistoricized or psychologized account of violence and vulnerability that fails to address the norms and structures of social injustice and violence. Attention to the linkage between affect, ethics, politics, and nonviolence then highlights the value of rethinking nonviolence in education as affective practice that attempts to rupture normative practices of violence, acknowledging the possibility of both resistance and complicity, including their asymmetries, raises important questions that could inspire a reconsideration of pedagogies for nonviolence in various sociopolitical settings. For example, whose lived experiences of violence and vulnerability do teachers and students explore in the classroom? How are complicities, symmetrical or asymmetrical, for different individuals or groups featured in different forms of violence, both within school settings and beyond those? What can be done to minimize forms of violence and complicity through affective practices of nonviolence, such as solidarity, hospitality, and conviviality? These questions offer a conceptualization of nonviolence as anti-complicity action, that is, an ongoing struggle that attempts to bring to the surface hidden aspects of violence and complicity and face them productively by imagining new affective relations with others. This account requires from the teacher to, quote unquote, translate nonviolence into specific strategies for collective resistance that are critically conscious of the constant risks of complicity. These strategies of nonviolence as resistance could include, for example, educational policies and pedagogical practices that actively oppose forms of violence which perpetuate precarious conditions for vulnerable and marginalized students, students with disabilities, refugee children, migrant children, school and community projects that expand possibilities to form solidarities and take specific actions against recognized forms of violence, such as racism, xenophobia, homophobia in schools and local communities. Strategies such as these are important not only because they cultivate in students anti-complicity attitudes, but also because they do not blame the individual for their complicity in violence and social injustices. Rather, these strategies inspire specific acts that explore under which conditions in their everyday lives may begin to oppose systemic violence that continues to harm people, especially those who are marginalized. To conclude now, helping to foster nonviolence as resistance to violence in the classroom can occur in many forms, often forms that are not irrelevant to the conditions that trigger feelings of ethical responsibility towards others. These feelings, as Butler seems to be telling us, must always be conjoined with relentless critical exposure of norms that separate those lives considered to be grievable from those that do not count as such. This critique should eventually engage all of us in meaningful solidarity. Educators can make a significant contribution to nonviolent approaches in education by translating these ideas into pedagogies that render violence explicit and visible, formulate effective infrastructures of solidarity in schools, and nurture nonviolence as action that resists or interrupts the repetition of normative violence. The pandemic and the recent wars around the world have created a lot of suffering, but it also gives us a chance, to do things differently in the future if we can resist, if we can recast relationality as interdependency and making it an ethics and politics committed to social equality. I leave you with Judith Butler's words a few months ago in the aftermath of Hamas's attack on Israel on October the 7th. Oops. Well, I'll read you the quote. Personally, I defend a politics of nonviolence in the knowledge that it cannot possibly operate as an absolute principle to be applied on all occasions. I maintain that liberation struggles that practice nonviolence help to create the nonviolent world in which we all want to live. Without equality and justice, without an end to the state violence, no future can be imagined, no future of true peace. Not that is peace as a euphemism for normalization, which means keeping structures of inequality, rightlessness, and racism in place. But such a future cannot come about without remaining free to name, describe, and oppose all the violence in all its forms. Thank you for your attention. So I'm happy to hear comments, questions. Yes.
So I have a comment. Butler borrows a lot from Gandhi, but does not really acknowledge that.